My name is Jim Blow. I'm the administrative coordinator here at the Science Museum. I've been working at the museum for about 4 years. Prior to that, I served 28 years in the United States Army, retired in 2017, and came to the museum. I have a bachelor's degree in history from the University of Washington, and I have a master's degree in history from American Military University. Today, I'm going to be presenting I Wonder What's in It, How Science Made Food Safe. I will let you know in advance. I cannot be held responsible for any effects this presentation might have on your appetite, because we're going to be talking about the food supply in the United States and elsewhere prior to passage of food safety laws. And there's some pretty gnarly stuff involved, I don't mind telling you. Humans have been making alterations to our food since the very beginning of our history as a species. Our ancestors figured out a long time ago that if you made certain alterations to food, like smoking it or salting it, you could preserve them for later use. And then they would work with things like spices and other things to make food taste better. But most importantly was to resist spoilage so you could save food for later. So there's a fine line between an additive and an adulterant. Oftentimes the line between an additive and an adulterant is simply the law. So it wasn't necessarily used as deception. Adulteration could be used as deception to take a bad product and disguise it as a good product. And one of the earliest products that they did that with during ancient times was wine. So the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans obviously had a passion for wine. If you visited our Pompeii exhibit the summer before last, then you'll be aware of how ancient wine was made. It wasn't exactly the scientific sanitary process like it is today. It was very subject to spoilage. Even at its best, it probably was not anything we'd recognize as good wine today. So it would be stabilized with things like seawater or maybe marble dust to clarify it and stabilize it. It would have herbs and spices added to it. But another popular additive was this stuff called defrutum or sapa. And that was made by taking grape juice and boiling it in a lead pot until it was reduced. So that could be then added to wine, and they use it for other cooking methods also. But you could take that, put it into bad wine, and make it taste like better wine. Also, what you got in the bargain was a healthy dose of this stuff right here. This is lead acetate, and that's what would be formed when you were cooking this grape juice in this lead pot. It had to be a lead pot because they wanted that sweetness that you got from cooking in the lead pot. So it got to the point where the guy in the picture here is Pliny the Elder. He wrote in his natural histories that in his day, even the wealthy, even the aristocrats, struggled to find good wine because it had all been adulterated with various things to kind of dress it up and make bad wine taste like good wine. Adulteration of any product is possible because of a couple of different things. First, you have to have an urbanized population that lives far from where the product is produced. And second, you need a complicated supply chain where products pass through a lot of hands before they make it to the consumer. So that makes it possible for dishonest people to kind of cheat the system a little bit. Something like spices, where it traveled a great distance to get to market and a lot of people handled it. They were very subject to adulteration. But basically, it came to be that most consumer products were adulterated in one form or another. So this is a magazine called Puck. And if you look there, this person is running all kinds of chemical tests with a microscope and all sorts of scientific apparatus. That's only sort of a joke, as I'm going to discuss here in a little bit. The idea being that you had no idea what was in your food and you basically needed some sort of scientific knowledge to figure out what had been put into it. So one of the products that was frequently adulterated was bread. So this is basically a typical example of bread. Looks good, I think. So bread you would think would typically have in it flour, water, salt, and yeast, and that would be pretty much it. But all kinds of things could be added into it. If you wanted your bread to be whiter, you could add things like alum or chalk. You could make your flour stretch a little bit further if you added barley flour to it, or if you added rice flour to it. You could also add all kinds of other adulterants. Bread was sold by weight. You could add things like pipe clay to it to make your loaf heavier, so that you could in that way make a little bit more profit. And this disproportionately affected poor people. Rich people could afford to buy the best products. People who were poor had fewer options, so they had to go buy the adulterated stuff from people who were maybe less than honest. So in 1820, this guy comes on the scene and rapidly starts trying to change things. This gentleman's name is Frederick Ackham. So Frederick Ackham was from Westphalia in Germany, and he grew up eating just simple country food. He was used to eating good country cured hams and good German beer and good bread. And above all, he loved a good cup of coffee, much like myself. The problem was that in London, this was not to be found. Unadulterated coffee was just unavailable anywhere. Now, you could, of course, try to buy whole bean coffee, but there would even be fake coffee beans. And there was a patented machine. So the plans to make for a machine to make fake coffee beans were actually on file with the British Patent Office because it was not illegal to do it. So you could, even if you're buying whole bean coffee, you could actually end up getting an adulterated product. So cheap synthetic dyes made from coal tar had been introduced in the 1800s. Those could be used in all kinds of different products like jams, for example. Your jam was probably not strawberry jam at all, even though it said that on the label. It could be nothing more than fruit pectin, some red coal tar dye, and some sugar, and maybe a few random seeds to make it look like it was made from strawberries. Arsenic pigments, copper pigments, they could be used to give color to tea, to candies, to pickles, canned vegetables. Red lead was used to give some cheese, like Double Gloucester, the right color. So as I mentioned, even candies that were sold to children could have toxic dyes in them. So Ackham produced this book. It was basically a treatise on adulterations of food, and he included methods for detecting them. Now, he was not the only one that did this. His book was very famous in Britain and in the States. So Ackham basically included simple tests that people could do at home to figure out if their food had been adulterated. Like, for example, if you suspected that your cream had been adulterated by adding flour to it, you could put a little iodine in there. It would react with the starch in the cream, and it would change it to a specific color to alert you to the fact that your cream had been adulterated. So Ackham's book was a sensation in Britain and in the United States in 1820. So chemistry could tell you a lot of things. It couldn't tell you all the time when adulteration had occurred. Sometimes it took things like microscopic analysis. This is Arthur Hill Hassel. He was a British physician, wrote for the Lancet, and he went around London with his trusty microscope and bought different products, put them under the microscope, and took a look at them to see what it actually was. And this is what coffee looks like under the microscope when it's been adulterated. So you can see those little sponge-looking things there. That's actual coffee. The rest is either chicory or it's roasted wheat. Coffee could sometimes be adulterated with things like burnt peas, burnt beans, anything that was brown and granular and looks something like coffee. And even the chicory itself could be adulterated. So getting a pure cup of coffee was a very difficult thing to pull off at the time. And it would be labeled pure coffee. There'd be no way of knowing from looking at the label what was in there and what wasn't. And as I said already, that was true of a lot of products. And sometimes this would have actually deadly results, as I'm about to discuss. The British public was, of course, up in arms about this, but the British Parliament, as with the government of the United States, anything that could injure trade was very, very difficult to get passed. So Parliament was not about to let a little public outrage make them pass a law that could potentially injure trade. Something really bad had to happen, and in 1858, it did. Oh, I almost forgot about Fanny Farmer. Fanny Farmer was an American cookbook author, and she actually included in her work scientific tests to verify whether food had been adulterated or not. But more importantly, she also included writings about sanitation and germ theory and how to safely prepare food. So, 1858, something really bad happens in Bradford, England. This was the day before Halloween. There was a candy seller named William Hardacre, and William Hardacre wanted to put some peppermint out for sale at the market. So he contacts a local candy maker who he would buy from, and he orders 40 pounds of peppermints. So the candy maker sends his apprentice off to the local pharmacy and has him bring back 12 pounds of plaster of Paris. So this would be to add to the sugar so that you could make the sugar go further. Sugar was very expensive. It was very heavily taxed. So it would be common practice for candy makers or confectioners to add various things called DAF to their sugar. In this case, plaster of Paris was what he wanted. So the candy maker is preparing the candy, and he began to feel ill while he was doing it, but he didn't really think anything of it. The candy didn't look quite right when it was done. It looked a bit odd, so much so that William Hardacre, the candy seller, actually demanded and got a discount. William Hardacre tried the candy. He also got sick, but he also thought nothing of it and put the candy out for sale. So the candy starts selling, and very shortly thereafter, people begin to become violently ill. So around 200 people eventually get sick. 2 children at least die from it. At first, it was mistaken for food poisoning, which foodborne illness was endemic at the time, so that would not have been unusual. Cholera was also suspected, but finally they put the dots together and they figured out that the candy was the culprit. They trace it back to William Hardacre, they trace it back to the pharmacist, and although several people were arrested, no one actually went to jail. And this was very common at the time. It was not illegal for them to adulterate this product. The problem is that the white powder was actually not plaster of Paris. It was white arsenic. So the apprentice had gone into the back room, taken 12 pounds of white powder out of an open barrel, and as I mentioned, it was white arsenic. It was not plaster of Paris. You could legally walk into a shop in Britain at the time, and in the United States as well, and you could simply buy white arsenic. And that's exactly what happened here. So this was finally what pushed it over the edge in Britain. And the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act was passed in 1860, along with a few other laws, one of them restricting the sale of arsenic. Wasn't particularly strong on enforcement. It was a very strong compromise with business, but it set a precedent. It set the precedent that the onus would now start to be on the person who is selling the goods versus the consumer. Before this, it was the buyer's problem, whatever happened. This starts to reverse that a little bit and starts to put the burden on the seller that they're selling a good product. So now let's go ahead and let's move over. This is Death as a candy seller. He's making some peppermints there. He's got his arsenic and plaster of Paris, as you can see. So let's go ahead and take this back to the States. Here we go. So before the Civil War, the United States was still mostly an agrarian country. Even the cities still had farmland relatively close by where people could still get fresh food. So if you live in a small town, if you live close to where your food is produced, you probably know who it is that produced it and who it is that's selling it to you. If your local milkman is giving you bad milk, word is going to get around and people are not going to buy milk from him anymore, so it could damage his business. So it would make people a lot more careful about what they were producing. But after the Civil War, cities start to grow bigger and bigger, places like New York and Chicago, and all the farmland gets bought up to expand the city. So people are further and further away from sources of fresh food. Now, particularly milk would be a problem. Milk spoils quickly, especially before pasteurization, which was not happening at the time. So what would happen is the milkman would come around. So here you see Death as the milkman, and would basically dole out the milk to the people in the city. So milk was a filthy product at the time. It contained all manner of germs, all manner of contaminants. And then, of course, to keep the milk from spoiling while you were trying to get it to where you wanted it to go, there were preservatives that could be put in the milk. Things like benzoic acid or formaldehyde or borax. Also, the milk would be watered down very frequently, and the water itself would actually be contaminated. And then you would add things like maybe a little chalk or maybe a little dye, some molasses to give the milk the right color, give it the right consistency, so you could hide the fact that the milk wasn't what it was supposed to be. And there are all kinds of other things that could go in there as well. But another innovation that came out of people living in cities and being far away from sources of fresh milk is stuff called swill milk. So what swill milk was it was a dairy that was set up next to a distillery, and it was in these dark, dank barns. The cows were crowded in there in filthy conditions. So very dirty, filthy, germ-ridden place to be producing milk. And they would feed the cows with what was called the swill, or the leftover mash from the distilleries, which was very poor in nutrient value. It rotted the animals' teeth. The animals would frequently become sick, and a lot of times they would just simply drop dead right there in the dairy. And this is what was being sold to people in the city, and it was blamed for the deaths of thousands of children every single year. So microscopic analysis will show, this is from Arthur Hassel again. This is milk adulterated with sheep's brains. Why would milk be adulterated with sheep's brains? Because if you wanted to create the illusion that the milk had a layer of cream on top, what you would do is puree some sheep's brains, put that in the milk, and then you'd have a layer on top that might look like it was cream. It wasn't, of course, but you couldn't tell that unless you looked at it under a microscope. So again, pediatricians blamed swill milk for the deaths of thousands of children every year. And when researchers looked at the stuff, they frequently found hair, worms, dirt, sticks, insects. There was one study where they tried to do a count of the number of bacteria colonies in a sample of milk, and they literally gave up. There were so many bacteria colonies present that the researchers simply could not count them all. So New York City officially banned swill dairies in 1862, but because of political corruption, really nothing was done. They continued to operate. And after a time, it became easier to find products that were adulterated than products that weren't. So coming on the scene is this man here. That is Harvey Washington Wiley. Now, Harvey Washington Wiley was born in Indiana in a log cabin, a farmhouse. Graduated from Indiana Medical College as an MD, and he graduated from Harvard with a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry, and then went on to study in Germany, which was where all the chemical innovation in the world was going on. So he worked for a little while at Purdue as a chemistry professor. He worked for the state chemist for Indiana, and as a state chemist for Indiana, the first thing he was asked to look into, which might have been considered food adulteration, was honey and maple syrup. And of course, he found rampant adulteration. It was basically just sugar, water, and a little bit of coloring. And with the honey, even the piece of honeycomb that was in the jar was even fake. That was just a piece of paraffin. Wiley gets hired as the chief chemist for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in 1882, and that's where his studies on food adulteration really start to pick up. It wasn't necessarily what he was hired for, but there was great public concern about food adulteration, and Wiley had strong feelings about that himself. He was worried that it was endangering people's health, and he also didn't like the fact that very often the consumer was being cheated by products that were deceptively labeled. And the first really big one he worked on was butter. So in the late 1800s in France, there was invented this product called Oleo Margarine. And what Oleo Margarine was just simply, it was animal fat, beef fat, pork fat, and that was combined with ground up animal stomachs. And it created a product that looked similar to butter, especially once you added yellow coloring compounds to it, which could themselves be toxic. As you can see here in the illustration, they're dumping whatever they can find into the vat there to get the animal fat and the animal stomachs, and then is labeled and sold as butter. So in 1887, there was an act passed called the Butter Act, and that outlawed selling butter as selling margarine products as butter. So products were labeled with names like butterine or lardine, but often enough, they were just simply called butter, even after the Butter Act was passed. So Wiley did microscopic and chemical examination of some randomly selected brands and found out that of the samples he took, a third of what was labeled as butter was actually not butter at all. It was these margarine products. So again, dangerous additives that no one knew what it would do to people long term because it had never been tested, and also it's defrauding the consumer. Wiley didn't like either one of those. Now, I have to say at this point that when we're talking about this issue of food adulteration and pure food laws, you cannot give enough credit to women and women's groups. This is actually a young lady named Anna Kelton, who worked at the Department of Agriculture around the same time as Wiley did. He actually entered into a relationship with her. He courted her for a little while. But the problem was that Wiley was twice her age and wasn't exactly considered suitable. Her mother wasn't terribly happy about it. So it really ended up not going anywhere. But Wiley carried a picture of her in his watch for over 20 years. So tucked into this story of bad adulterated food, there's a love story that I'm going to talk a little bit more about later on. But getting back to women's groups, I have the picture here of Anna Kelton because she herself was an activist. Tied up with the pure food movement, there was also the women's suffrage movement. There was the temperance movement. All of this is tied up into healthy living and pure food. It's estimated that women wrote over 1 million letters to the White House demanding a pure food law. So organized women's groups, and this was true in Britain also, organized women's groups really were an excellent tool to apply public pressure to get things done with regard to getting pure food laws passed. It was a high mountain to climb, as I'm going to discuss, because the meat packers, the food producers were very powerful. They had powerful friends in Congress, and actually getting a law passed was a really difficult thing to do, as I'm going to talk about. But I will come back to Anna Kelton later on. Right now, we are going to talk about a little thing called embalmed beef. So one thing that really makes Americans angry is when they perceive that their service members have been badly treated by the government. And in 1898, it appeared that that had happened when veterans of the Spanish-American War came home and they were telling about how they'd been fed embalmed beef while they were in Cuba. The veterans with experience in funeral homes swore that what they'd been fed smelled like embalming fluid. It smelled like formaldehyde. The tins contained, the meat was putrid, it was stringy, it was foul smelling. So the Beef Trust, of course, the meat packers were behind all of this. The meat that had been sent to Cuba to feed the soldiers and sailors came straight from the packing yards in Chicago. So the Beef Trust was behind the whole thing. So President McKinley decides he needs to do something about this because there was a huge public outcry. Because as I mentioned, few things make the public angrier than the perception that soldiers have been mistreated. So he appoints retired General Grenville Dodge to head a commission to look into the matter and find out what had gone on. And news of the Dodge Commission, this was followed coast to coast in the United States. This was in all the newspapers. Everyone wanted to hear the outcome of this. So Grenville Dodge is the head of the commission, and he actually called the commanding general of the Army. This is Major General Nelson Miles, a man with an amazing mustache game. So General Miles testified he had already conducted his own investigation, and he said that what the soldiers were alleging was all true, that the quality of the meat was terrible, it was tainted, it was not fit for their consumption. It was a national disgrace that the soldiers had been fed this way. The meat packers, of course, objected. They said that no one had ever sent any cans back. And a general named Egan, who was in charge of the commissary, who was in charge of providing the tinned meat to the soldiers. General Egan said that General Nelson Miles was a liar and that his lies should be forced back into his mouth along with the contents of a camp latrine. That is not the kind of thing that you say about a superior officer. And General Egan was actually charged and convicted in a court-martial. But by the way, he was not convicted for sending soldiers and sailors bad food. He was convicted because he had insulted a superior officer in public. So his punishment was he was tucked away quietly in an office somewhere and allowed to retire a few years later. So as far as what was done out of the Dodge Commission, nothing really happened. Well, this did not satisfy the public at all. So really what President McKinley had to do was take it a step further. So he convened what was called the Beef Court. So the Beef Court was supposed to look into it again and figure out what was going on. And McKinley asked the Bureau of Chemistry at the USDA to look into it as well. So Harvey Wiley got involved at this point. But someone who testified at the Beef Court was Teddy Roosevelt, who was obviously heavily involved in the Spanish-American War. And he railed against the quality of food that was supplied, said, "I would rather have eaten my hat." He had personally seen the effects of tainted meat on his soldiers. One of his soldiers, he saw him getting ready to throw away a meal of tinned roast beef. Roosevelt asked him what he was doing. He said, "I can't eat it, sir." Roosevelt said, "Don't be a baby," because this is typical of Roosevelt. Roosevelt told the man, "Stop being a baby and eat it." So the man ate it and he promptly vomited. Roosevelt himself survived on beans and rice the entire time he was in Cuba. So Harvey Wiley looks into this, and Wiley's conclusion was that yes, when looking at random samples that he had taken from the packing houses, the meat was of pure quality and appearance, not particularly clean. That wasn't unexpected. That was no better or worse than what would have been sold to American consumers at the time. The spoilage was probably because the meat was poorly preserved to start with and it sat in the tropical heat. And then there was also the psychological effect of these soldiers having to day after day after day eat the same disagreeable food. So there was a psychological component maybe to it as well. And also you could not discount the fact that nearly everyone that went to Cuba got some sort of tropical disease. And then, of course, camp sanitation was not good either. So there were all kinds of factors that could play into it. But still, nothing really happened. There was a big public outcry, but nothing really came of it. No real changes were made. So the Beef Court really, in the end, came to nothing. But fear not, something else is coming right around the corner. So at this point, Congress has decided that they really need to start looking into preservatives. And they ask Harvey Wiley, as the chief of chemistry at the USDA, to start doing that. Because keeping food preserved was obviously something that was very desirable. You wanted food to resist spoilage. There was really no refrigeration at the time other than putting things on ice. Things had to travel. It was not supermarkets like today where you could get fresh food at any time you wanted. So preservatives were going to be used. The problem is that these preservatives had not been tested. No one knew what the long-term effects were, especially on children or people with compromised health. So Harvey Wiley convenes what he called the sanitary table trials, but what most everyone else called the poison squad. So the poison squad was a group of 12 volunteers who agreed to serve for 1 year. These were, to keep it standardized, 12 young men in good health who had passed the civil service exam and who were of good moral character. So the first thing they started out with was borax. They wanted to test the effects of borax on consumers. Borax was in a lot of food products at the time, so it was really hard to say how much borax someone would get in 1 day. But they made the best estimate they could. It was kind of on the high side. So what they did was 6 of the volunteers would take the borax 1 week, 6 of the volunteers would take it the next week, and then they'd switch off. This was somewhat out of concern for the health of the participants in the study. Because again, they're taking a fairly high dose, but one that was theoretically possible for a normal person to eat in the course of a day. But problems started to creep in at the outset. the volunteers would get wise to where the borax was. If they figured out the borax was in the milk, then they wouldn't drink the milk. If they figured out that the borax was in the butter, then they'd stop using the butter. So what Wiley eventually did was he had capsules of borax put on the table, and at every course they would have to take a capsule of borax. So by today's standards, this is not a great study because the people who are taking the substance that's being tested are aware that they're doing it, and the people who are not taking it know that they're not taking it. So it's not a double blind. It's not, again, by today's standards, not a great study. But it was at least something. It was testing it to see what the effects would be. So the poison squad didn't make it through the 5th round of this before the study was stopped. Many of the volunteers experienced head and stomach pains, and no one knew what the cumulative effect of large doses of borax would be over the course of someone's life. There was just no way to know. But the poison squad would continue to test other preservatives, formaldehyde, salicylic acid. There were all kinds of preservatives that were being put in food, including patented preservatives that had never been tested. So remember, at this time, there was no requirement to test a preservative for safety before it was put into food. There was no law, no regulation in place that required them to do that. So if a food producer wanted to put something in food, they would simply do it. It would not be on the label. No one would have any way of knowing. So until something bad happened, no one was really going to do anything. And even when something bad did happen, there was no real law in place to do any enforcement, as we saw with the embalmed beef scandal. So this is, if you see down in the lower left-hand corner there, none but the brave can eat the fare. That was a sign which was in the dining room that the poison squad used. And there in the back on the right is old Borax himself, Harvey Wiley. They actually tagged him with the nickname Old Borax. So 1901, President McKinley is assassinated, and he is replaced by Vice President Theodore Roosevelt. So Theodore Roosevelt had a reputation as a reformer, to the point that he actually worried a lot of politicians. Even in the Republican Party, he worried a lot of politicians. One person remarked, "Now look, that damn cowboy is now the president of the United States." Wiley had something of an ally now in his efforts to get a pure food law passed, because that was something that was very much on Roosevelt's radar. The problem was that he made a few missteps with Roosevelt, so his relationship with the president was not great. Wiley had a very strong sense of what was right and wrong. He could be very strident and uncompromising about that. And Roosevelt was also very strident, but he was aware of the need for compromise in political situations. Wiley was not. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the relationship between Wiley and the president later, because it is going to come up. So still struggling through 1901, 1902, trying to get a food law passed, and just could not get anywhere because the business interests were just too powerful. They had too many friends in Congress, could not get anything through. So help was going to come from an unexpected source in 1906. So this is kind of a political cartoon about the meat trust, Packingtown. There was one verse: "Mary had a little lamb when it began to sicken. She took it down to Packingtown, and now it's labeled chicken." So help would come from an unexpected source, as I mentioned, and that would be a book called The Jungle by this man, Upton Sinclair. So I'm sure many of us have read The Jungle. If you haven't, it is a stomach-churning read. This really pulled back the curtain on what was going on in the meatpacking industry. Sinclair kind of went undercover. He went in and checked things out. Now, his reasoning for doing this was not to expose what was going on with the production of meat products. It was to expose the poor conditions that the workers were laboring under and the low pay. Upton Sinclair was a socialist. He was first and foremost concerned with the workers. But his details about what were going on inside with the food was what really got people's attention. So Upton Sinclair wrote about sick animals would be processed for sale. There was no regard for sanitation at all. Privies were just simply open pits. The tables were made out of wood. The carts that the carcasses were carted around in were made of wood. So, of course, that would absorb liquid. It became germ infested. There was no way to clean that. Meat would fall onto the floor and it would be picked right back up, put back on the table and processed. There were laborers who were working with the food who had tuberculosis and would spit on the floor after they were coughing. And of course, the meat would be on the floor and then back onto the table and right down the line. Putrid meat would be kind of tuned up with borax and other preservatives and chemicals, and that would be packaged for sale. Rats and insects were rampant. Rats would run all over the meat. There was rat excrement all over the meat, on and on. There was even one case that Sinclair talked about where a worker fell into a rendering vat, and before they had realized it, the contents of the vat had been sold as pure leaf lard. This really hit home with the American public like nothing else. But the problem is that Sinclair was a socialist, so it was a little hard to take him seriously. And again, it was a novel. The Jungle was not a work of nonfiction. It was a work of fiction. So it was really hard for Roosevelt to take it 100% seriously. A lot of the reason for that was because he kind of thought Sinclair was a crackpot. He thought he was unrealistic, and the fact that he was a socialist definitely did not help his case. So what Roosevelt decides he's going to do is Roosevelt sends a couple of his own investigators, a man named Charles Neal and a man named James Reynolds. And he sent them to Chicago and said, I want you to look into this and figure out what's going on, find out if Sinclair is really telling the truth. So he sent them on, and this is, by the way, the meat packers had time to clean up a little bit because they knew the investigators were coming. It didn't do any good. Neal and Reynolds basically went. They confirmed that essentially everything Sinclair had said was completely true. The only thing they couldn't verify was that someone had fallen into a rendering vat and been sold as lard. And the only reason they couldn't do that is because when deaths would happen on the job, the widows would get paid off and then kind of shuffled off somewhere where no one could talk to them. So this was a bombshell report. And it was easy to dismiss Sinclair. It was a lot harder to dismiss investigators that Roosevelt had sent out himself. So Roosevelt has kind of got this report tucked away in his pocket that he can kind of pull out at will and discreetly use to apply pressure. The problem was Upton Sinclair was just out of patience. So what happens is Upton Sinclair had become friendly with Neal and Reynolds. He gets all the information that he can, and he goes straight to the press. And of course, it caused a sensation that everything that Upton Sinclair had said were actually true. So this infuriated Roosevelt because it forced his hand. So what Roosevelt did was, now he had no choice. He submits kind of an extract and kind of an overview of the Neal Reynolds report to the press. And then he goes to Congress and says, look, if I don't have pure food legislation on my desk right away, I'm going to release the remainder of the report to the press. So finally, the jig was up. And in 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 was passed, and the Federal Meat Inspection Act of 1906 was passed. So these were seen just as a triumph at the time. But they were really less than perfect. It was something. It was a lot more than they managed to get passed before. But it was very much a piece of compromise legislation. There was no real standards of enforcement. There were no standards as to what constitutes pure food, what constitutes an additive. There was no requirement that things be labeled accurately until 1913, when an amendment was put on the law to require a contents label. And they could not pre-approve food additives. There was no power for the government to approve food additives prior to them being put into food. They could only do it once it had been put on the market, and then they could take action. Now, the good part is that enforcement was put directly in the hands of Harvey Wiley. So Harvey Wiley, as the chief chemist of the USDA, was responsible for enforcement, which would prove to be a little bit trickier than it sounds. as I'm going to get into. But this was widely called Dr. Wily's Law. And Wily was, at this point, he was a national hero. People saw him as someone who was standing up for the consumer, who was standing up to big business, and that made him very popular and made him essentially bulletproof as far as anyone trying to fire him. And we're going to talk about that here also. So there starts to be trouble at the USDA. Now, this is Wily here. This is later in life, obviously. So Wily had been at the USDA for about 20 years at this point. And he had made a lot of enemies because he was so strident and did not have a tendency to compromise. And he was a nonstop source of irritation to his superior Agriculture Secretary James Wilson. So I mentioned before that he had a bit of a strained relationship with the president. And things really came to a head one day when he was meeting with the president and some food canners. And the food canners were asking specifically about saccharin. They were worried about not being able to put saccharin in their corn because it would cost them an extra $4,000 or so a year to use sugar. So they asked the president about this directly. Well, Wily chimed in and answered on the president's behalf that saccharin was dangerous to health. Now, talking out of turn with Roosevelt probably would not have been a huge deal. What the problem is that Roosevelt's own doctor gave him saccharin every single day because Roosevelt was starting to get a little portly. So Roosevelt looked at Wily and said, "Are you telling me that saccharin is dangerous to health?" Wily responds, "Yes, Mr. President, I'm saying that saccharin is dangerous to health." Roosevelt pounds the table and he turns purple and he says, "Any man who says saccharin is dangerous to health is an idiot." So that right there was the moment where Wily pretty much blew his relationship with Teddy Roosevelt, which was not great to start with because he and Teddy Roosevelt in a lot of ways are very similar and tended to butt heads. And this really kind of broke the relationship permanently. Now, Roosevelt thought that Wily was very valuable. He thought that the work he was doing was important, but he thought that he was not realistic. He had a tendency to be unswerving, and that was no way to get things done in politics. So what Roosevelt does the following day is he appoints a scientific review board. And someone who was all for that was who I mentioned before, the Secretary of Agriculture, James Wilson, who by this point was really tired of Wily in a lot of ways. Wily had spoken out of turn in public a few times and caused Wilson some problems. And Wilson was at this point pretty much fed up with Wily, but there was no way to get rid of him because if you were to get rid of someone as popular as Wily, who was seen to be a champion of the little people, you were very much going to cause a massive public backlash. So they appoint the Remsen Board. Now, the Remsen Board was a scientific review board that, and this is something that the meatpacking interests had wanted in the first place. They had wanted somebody to kind of be able to counteract Wily if they needed to. So Ira Remsen actually was the discoverer of saccharin. So kind of just a jab at Wily. They appointed the guy who studied saccharin to head the review board. So anything that Wily found, any of his findings, before it could be published, it had to go through the Remsen Board, and the Remsen Board had to concur. And if they didn't, it could not be published. So this was kind of a way to place a check on Wily. Now, another little weakness in the food and drug law was that products that had specific names, like there on the right, see that stuff bread spread? Strawberry flavor bread spread. It's masquerading as jam. It is not actually jam. It's just sugar, a little bit of dye, and that's really about it. There's hardly any strawberries in it at all. But this was not considered deceptive labeling because it was not saying that it was strawberry jam, even though it was clearly meant to appear like it. That was just one of the effects of one of the shortcomings of the 1906 law. And it was, as I mentioned, kind of tough to enforce. But Wily wanted to try to do it. So in 1911, He decides he's going to go, 1909. 1911 when it went to court. So in 1909, Wiley decides he wants to take on a really big fish. He decides he wants to take a run at Coca-Cola. Now, it was one thing to go after a smaller regional soda maker. Wiley wanted to go after Coca-Cola, who was the big fish in the pond. And the reason he wanted to go after Coca-Cola was for a couple of reasons. Number one, even though the name was Coca-Cola, it no longer contained cocaine, and it did not contain cola nut extract. So that right there is deceiving the consumer, because Coca-Cola did not actually have cocaine or cola nut in it any longer. But what was particularly concerning to Wiley is that it contained caffeine. So caffeine was something that Wiley was very concerned about. Long-term effects were not known, and Coca-Cola was widely consumed by children. This concerned Wiley greatly. I should also add that at this particular time, Coke had about twice as much caffeine in it as it does now. So it was pretty strong stuff. And Wiley's attitude towards it was parents would not allow their children to drink coffee. They certainly should not allow them to be freely drinking Coca-Cola. So Wiley requests permission to seize 40 barrels and 20 kegs of Coca-Cola syrup. Permission is granted reluctantly by Wilson, because the only reason that it happened was because it was in danger of being leaked to the press that Wilson was not allowing Wiley to do his job. So Wiley was allowed to seize this product, which he did. The thing goes to court, and there it is, that lovely alkaloid that I love so much. That is caffeine, and that's what Wiley was so concerned about. So Wiley had this expert witness. Henry Hurd Rusby. Henry Hurd Rusby was a pharmacologist, and he was also greatly concerned about caffeine. He was the star witness at the Coca-Cola trial. Now, the Coca-Cola trial, Coke was outraged by this. They responded with their own double-blind study showing their product was perfectly safe. They had person after person after person who was a satisfied Coca-Cola customer. Rusby had done his own investigations, said that the conditions at the Coca-Cola manufacturing plant were terrible and filthy, and that he had traveled around the country and seen children buying Coca-Cola, and this was completely unsuitable. Well, the case was thrown out of that court on a technicality. It ended up going all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States and was eventually settled in the Supreme Court. Coke agreed to reduce the amount of caffeine in its product by half, and it agreed to pay the court cost. Now, I brought up Rusby for a very specific reason, because Wiley's enemies at the USDA decided to use Rusby to really take a run at him. Rusby was not being paid nearly enough because of a new government regulation, so Wiley came up with an arrangement to pay him that it was not unethical, but it was unorthodox. And his opponents at the USDA tried to use this to charge Wiley with misuse of government funds, including this one man in particular, a lawyer named George McCabe, who was a solicitor for the USDA. And this whole thing just backfired on them spectacularly. It came out in public that Wiley was being persecuted by Wilson and McCabe, and the public just went crazy. It looked to them like this man, who was a champion of consumers and of pure food, was being victimized by people who were advocates for big business. So Wiley came out of it scot-free. He finally had evidence that people were really out to get him in his own agency, and Wilson actually made it to the end of his term of office and resigned. He had served under 3 presidents, but that was it for him. He was out. But by 1912, Wiley was just done with it all. He had been in government for 26 years. He was tired of the constant fighting, and he was newly married. So you remember earlier I talked about Anna Kelton. They actually met up again in 1912. So they kind of rekindled the relationship, and this time when Wiley asked her to marry him, she said yes. So they were married. So by 1912, Wiley's ready to make a change. He'd been getting job offers all the time while he was at the USDA. So he accepted one from Good Housekeeping magazine, which would net him double the salary he was making at the USDA. It would get him his own state-of-the-art testing laboratory and full editorial control, essentially, from Good Housekeeping. He could test any product he liked. He had full editorial control over what he wrote. And what Good Housekeeping had at the time was called the Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval. So those of us who are old enough will remember that products used to advertise that they had the Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval. That became something that manufacturers very much wanted. And they were only going to get it if their product passed muster with Harvey Wiley. And it got through his lab and made it through to his standards. Then and only then could they get the Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval. So companies started to realize that if they could manufacture food that would be unadulterated and that would be clean food, that this would be good business. So companies start doing things like this right here. You can see it's got the seal of purity on it. It says it's guaranteed under the Food and Drugs Act of 1906. All of that is completely meaningless. It kind of implies that it had been inspected by the government. It hadn't, because there was no inspection regime at the time to do it. So they're kind of sort of being a little bit deceptive. The product may or may not have met the standards of the Pure Food and Drugs Act, because again, enforcement was very spotty. But companies realized that this was big business. And if they got on board and cleaned up their act, they could make a lot of money. And somebody who truly made a lot of money was H.J. Heinz. H.J. Heinz began producing the famous Heinz ketchup. And within a couple of years, it was the leading manufacturer of tomato products in the world. By a long stretch. It was by 1908, it was the largest manufacturer of tomato products in the world. And Heinz, you look right there on the bottle, free from benzoate of soda, which was a very controversial additive at the time. So other companies start to follow suit because they realized that consumers wanted pure food. Now, I should say about Heinz tomato ketchup, it had a ton of sugar in it, but that was less of a problem for Wiley than the fact that it didn't have any chemicals in it. So when you look at things like White Castle, which was founded in 1921, White Castle was founded on the idea that they could basically reinvent the hamburger. They could make it good food again. Because let's face it, after you had read The Jungle, would you want to eat a hamburger after that? Because there's no telling what had gone on the meat grinder. But White Castle, America's first fast food chain, they had very strict standards of cleanliness. Everyone was in white uniforms. Everything was stainless steel. Everything was all about being clean and sanitary. So this was really an idea that had caught on. So Wiley himself continued with Good Housekeeping. He passed away in 1930, 24 years to the day of the passage of the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act. And as I mentioned, the Pure Food and Drug Act was not perfect, but the people who came to power at the USDA and eventually what would eventually become the FDA were people that had basically been mentored by Wiley. They believed in what he believed in. So his impact, his legacy would continue on for years. And eventually in 1938, there would be updates to the 1906 Act, but the United States Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act would be passed in 1938. And there have been additional food laws since then. But Wiley's legacy carried on long after he was at the Bureau of Chemistry at the USDA. So I should real quickly, while I have time, I'll talk references. If you have not read The Poison Squad by Deborah Blum and you are interested at all in this, you should definitely pick up The Poison Squad by Deborah Blum. She is amazing. She's a great writer. It's a great story. I've just scratched the surface of all of this. You should definitely take a look at that. Another book you should definitely read if you're interested in this subject at all is called Swindled by B. Wilson. Again, another just terrifying book, what used to go into food. But you should definitely check out Swindled. And again, I've stuck to references that are commonly available that you can just pick up on Amazon. Marion Nestle, Food Politics. This is also a very good book that goes more into modern times. So Marion Nestle, you should definitely take a look at. And of course, the Bible, as far as I'm concerned with food science, is On Food and Cooking by Harold McGee. Again, you should definitely check that out if you're interested at all in food science and cooking. All right, so that's it. I did have some bonus content, but I am going to take a couple of questions. I see one question here. What's a rendering vat? So a rendering vat is basically what you would do is you would throw basically animal fat into or meat that had a lot of fat on it. You throw it into the rendering vat, you'd heat it up, and then you would basically skim off the fat, and you would sell that as lard or beef fat or something like that. Any other questions? When was salt used? Salt has been a preservative for a very, very long time, thousands of years. Smoking and salting are probably the oldest methods of food preservation that we know. All right, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you all for being here today. I greatly appreciate it. Do enjoy your Thanksgiving. I hope this has not ruined your appetites. But once again, thank you all for being here. I'm happy that you all came. Next week, we're going to have a PhD candidate from Virginia Tech with us, Serena Whittingham, and she is studying with the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, and she is going to be presenting how plants can save our salt marshes. So salt marshes are very critical environmental features. They can help mitigate against things like sea level rise. And Serena's doing some great research on that for her doctorate. So please do check that out. Once again, thank you all for coming. Until next week, stay safe and stay curious.